what it took to live as a peasant. Customs and traditions in the Dark Ages. Most people have no idea what that sentence truly means. They picture a simple farmer tilling a field, maybe humming a song under a bright afternoon sun, living a hard but honest life. But the truth is something far more brutal, far more suffocating, and far more heartbreaking than any modern mind could comfortably hold. This is the story of what life actually looked like for the millions of forgotten souls who built the world we inherited, and never got a single word of thanks for it. In the year 1247, in a small village called Wychford, nestled between the rolling hills of central England, a man named Aldrich woke before the sun, just as he had done every single day since he was old enough to stand. He was 31 years old, though his body looked closer to 50. His back was permanently curved from years of bending over the earth. His hands were so thick with calluses that he could grip a hot iron pot without flinching. His teeth, what remained of them, ached constantly, and the deep lines carved into his face told stories that his mouth never would. Aldrich was a villain, a bound peasant. He did not own the land he worked. He did not own the hut he slept in. In the eyes of the law, he barely owned himself. Everything he had, everything he would ever have, belonged to Lord Godfrey de Maric, the lord of the manor, whose stone house sat on the hill overlooking the village like a watchful predator. Aldrich's wife, Maren, was already awake. She always was. She had risen in the darkness to stir the embers of the fire that burned in the center of their one-room home. There was no chimney. The smoke simply rose and filled the space before slowly escaping through gaps in the thatched roof. Their 2 children, both under 6, slept on a pile of straw that also served as bedding for the family's single goat during the coldest months. The smell inside that hut, a thick mixture of animal dung, smoke, damp earth, and unwashed bodies, would have been unbearable to anyone not born into it. But for Maren, it was simply the smell of home. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a piece of dark, coarse bread made from a mixture of barley, rye, and whatever grain had survived the last harvest. There was no butter, no salt most days, just bread and water, and sometimes, if fortune smiled, a thin porridge of boiled oats. Maren divided the bread carefully. The largest piece went to Aldrich because he needed the strength to work the fields. The next pieces went to the children. What remained, a crust barely worth chewing, she kept for herself. This was not sacrifice born of choice. It was custom. It was simply the way things were. A peasant wife fed her husband first, her children second, and herself last. If there was nothing left, she did not eat, and nobody questioned it. The village of Wychford was home to roughly 40 families, all of them bound to Lord Godfrey's estate. The social structure was absolute and unquestioning. At the top sat the lord, whose word was law within the boundaries of his manor. Below him was the reeve, a peasant elected by the village, but who served the lord's interests, a man trapped between 2 worlds, trusted fully by neither. Below the reeve were the villains like Aldrich, who held small strips of land in the open fields in exchange for their labor. And below them were the cotters, who had almost nothing, a tiny garden perhaps, and the obligation to work for anyone who would feed them. There was no upward movement. There was no dream of becoming something more. A peasant was born a peasant, lived as a peasant, and died as a peasant. His children would do the same, and their children after them. The very idea of ambition, of wanting more, was not just impractical. It was considered sinful. The church taught that God had placed every soul exactly where it belonged. To question your station was to question God himself. And so generation after generation lived and died within the same few miles of earth, never knowing what lay beyond the next hill, never imagining a life that looked any different from the one they already endured. Aldrich's day began with work on the Lord's domain, the portion of land reserved exclusively for Lord Godfrey's profit. 3 days a week, sometimes more during harvest, Aldrich owed his labor to the Lord before he could tend his own strips. This was not optional. This was the fundamental contract of feudal life. The Lord provided protection, the land provided food, and the peasant provided his body, his muscles, his sweat, his years. If Aldrich failed to show up for his labor service, he would be fined. If he fled, he would be hunted. If he resisted, he could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. And yet, despite all of this, Aldrich did not think of himself as oppressed. That is perhaps the most haunting detail of peasant life in the Dark Ages. The system was so total, so deeply embedded in every aspect of existence, that most peasants simply accepted it as the natural order of the world. The sun rose, the rain fell, the Lord commanded, and the peasant obeyed. It had always been this way. It would always be this way. Maren watched Aldrich disappear into the fog that morning with a tightness in her chest she could not name. Their youngest child had been coughing for 3 days, and the sound was getting worse. She knew what that cough could mean. She had already buried one child 2 winters ago, a boy of barely 2 years, and the memory still sat in her body like a stone she could not swallow. But there was no physician in Witchford. There was no medicine. There was only prayer, and the herbs that old Edgith, the village wise woman, might offer, if the right ones could be found in the frozen ground. Maren pressed her hand against her child's forehead and felt the heat radiating through the skin. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to a God she desperately hoped was listening. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because every week we uncover the untold truths of history that were deliberately left out of your schoolbooks, and once you start watching, you will never see the past the same way again. The farming system that governed Aldrich's life was called the open field system, and it controlled nearly every aspect of food production in medieval England. The arable land surrounding Witchford was divided into 3 enormous fields, each one split into narrow strips allocated to different families. One field grew wheat or rye, another grew barley or oats. The third lay fallow, resting and recovering its strength for the next season. Every year, the crops rotated. Every year, the cycle repeated. It was efficient in its way, but it left almost no room for individual decision-making. Aldrich could not choose what to plant on his strips. He could not decide when to harvest. These decisions were made collectively by the village, enforced by the reeve, and ultimately approved by the Lord. The tools Aldrich used were primitive by any standard. His plough was a heavy wooden frame fitted with an iron blade that barely scratched the thick English clay. It required a team of oxen to pull, oxen that Aldrich did not own himself, but shared with 3 other families. This sharing arrangement, born of necessity, was the foundation of peasant community life. Everything was shared: oxen, ploughs, carts, even labor itself during harvest time. A peasant who refused to cooperate was not just antisocial, he was a threat to everyone's survival. And the village dealt with such threats harshly through public shaming, fines imposed at the manorial court, or simple social exclusion that could be as devastating as any physical punishment. Maren's daily life was no less grueling than Aldrich's, though it unfolded in different rhythms. Her responsibilities included tending the family's small garden plot beside their hut, where she grew cabbages, onions, peas, and herbs. She fed and milked the goat. She gathered firewood from the edges of the Lord's forest, carefully, always carefully, because taking too much or venturing too deep was a punishable offense. The forest belonged to the Lord, and its deer, its rabbits, its timber were all his property. A peasant caught hunting in the Lord's forest could lose a hand. This was not metaphor. This was law. Beyond her physical labor, Maren was also responsible for spinning wool, mending clothes, brewing the weak ale that served as the family's safest drink, since the water was often contaminated, and of course caring for the children. There was no separation between work and life. Every waking moment was consumed by the task of survival, and rest was something that arrived only when the body physically could not continue. The church was the single most powerful institution in the life of every medieval peasant. It regulated time itself. The calendar revolved around saints' days, feast days, and holy days, which together accounted for nearly a third of the year. On these days, peasants were forbidden from working their own land, though they were often still required to perform their labor service for the Lord. The church also collected the tithe, a tax of 1/10 of everything a peasant produced, 1/10 of the grain, 1/10 of the eggs, 1/10 of the wool. For families already living on the edge of starvation, this tithe could mean the difference between surviving the winter and watching a child die of hunger. And yet the peasants paid. They paid because they believed, with a sincerity that is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp, that their suffering in this life was temporary and that obedience would be rewarded in the next. The priest, Father Clement, was the only literate person in Wychford. He conducted services in Latin, a language none of the peasants understood, and interpreted the will of God according to doctrines that conveniently reinforced the existing social order. The Lord rules because God wills it. The peasant serves because God wills it. To suffer patiently is to earn salvation. These were not abstract theological concepts. They were the operating system of medieval society, and they ran in the background of every decision, every custom, every tradition that shaped peasant existence. The manorial court met several times a year, and attendance was mandatory for every adult male in the village. It was here that disputes were settled, fines were imposed, and the Lord's authority was reaffirmed in the most tangible terms. Aldrich had stood before this court twice in his life. The first time, he was fined 3 pence for allowing his goat to stray onto the Lord's meadow. The second time, he was accused by his neighbour, Wulfric, of moving a boundary stone between their strips, a serious offence that threatened the fragile cooperation upon which the entire village depended. Aldrich denied it. Wulfric insisted. The court ruled in Aldrich's favour only because old Edgith testified that she had seen the stone in its original position. But the accusation left a wound between the two men that never fully healed, and for months afterward they worked side by side in the fields without exchanging a single word. Marriage in medieval peasant society was less about love and more about survival strategy. When Aldrich married Maren, the arrangement was negotiated between their families with the Lord's approval, because a villain could not marry without the Lord's permission, and a fee called merchet had to be paid for the privilege. Maren brought into the marriage a dowry of 2 hens, a cooking pot, and a woolen blanket. These items, modest as they were, represented a significant investment from her family and were carefully recorded in the manorial rolls. Love, if it came at all, grew slowly in the cramped quarters of shared hardship, and for Aldrich and Maren it did grow, quietly, without grand gestures or spoken declarations, but in the steady rhythm of 2 people who faced every day together and asked nothing of each other except endurance. The harvest of 1247 was poor, not catastrophic, not yet, but poor enough that every family in Wychford felt the squeeze as autumn turned to winter. The summer had been wet, drowning the roots of the barley in the lower fields and encouraging a blight that crept through the rye like a slow poison. Aldrich had watched his strips carefully, pulling diseased stalks by hand when he could, but the damage was already done. His yield was down by nearly 1/3, and after the Lord's share was taken and the tithe was paid to the church, what remained was barely enough to feed his family through the Christmas season, let alone the long frozen months of January and February that stretched ahead like a sentence with no end. Lord Godfrey, however, showed no mercy in his collections. The steward arrived at each family's door with a written record of what was owed, and the quantities were not adjusted for the poor harvest. The logic from the Lord's perspective was simple. The obligation was fixed, and the peasant's misfortune was his own problem to manage. If Aldrich could not meet his obligations in grain, he could make up the difference in labour, or in coin if he had any, which he almost certainly did not. This system, which modern historians would later describe with clinical detachment as exploitative, was experienced by the peasants themselves as something far more personal. It was not a system. It was simply their lord taking what he was owed while their children went hungry, and there was nothing they could do about it. The coughing had gotten worse, much worse. Young Thomas, their 5-year-old, had developed a fever that rose and fell in waves, leaving him drenched in sweat 1 hour and shivering violently the next. Maren had tried everything she knew. She pressed warm poultices of chamomile and elderflower against his chest, recipes passed down from her mother and her mother's mother before that. She held him through the night, singing softly the only lullaby she remembered, a melody without clear words, more feeling than language. Old Edgith came and examined the boy, pressing her ear against his narrow chest, and when she stood up, the look in her eyes told Maren everything she needed to know without a single word being spoken. In the Dark Ages, a peasant child's chances of surviving to adulthood were roughly 1 in 2. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the simple brutality of the elements claimed young lives with a regularity that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Parents loved their children, desperately, fiercely, with every ounce of their exhausted hearts, but they also lived with the constant awareness that any child could be taken at any moment. Some historians have suggested that this awareness made medieval parents emotionally distant, that they protected themselves by not forming deep attachments, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The grief recorded in parish records, the small wooden crosses found in churchyards, the folk songs about lost children that survived for centuries, all of it points to a sorrow that was no less devastating for being common. Aldrich knelt beside his wife that evening and placed his hand over hers. He did not speak. There were no words adequate to the moment, and peasant culture did not encourage men to voice their grief openly. But his hand on hers said everything. I am here. I am afraid too. We will face this together, whatever comes. Maren leaned into him, and for a long moment the only sound in the hut was the crackling of the fire and the labored breathing of their son. Pause for a moment and think about this. If you had been born in the Dark Ages, with no choice, no freedom, and no voice, what would have kept you going? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply imagine ourselves in someone else's shoes. The days that followed were a kind of suspended agony. Thomas improved slightly, then worsened, then improved again, each swing of the pendulum tightening the knot in his parents' stomachs. Maren barely slept. Aldrich worked the fields in a daze, his body performing the motions his muscles had memorized years ago, while his mind remained fixed on the small figure lying on the straw back home. The other villagers helped where they could. A neighbor brought a cup of bone broth, another offered a blanket, old Edgith returned twice more with different herbs, and these small acts of kindness, unremarkable in isolation, were the invisible threads that held peasant communities together through centuries of hardship. No one in Witchford was truly alone, because no one could afford to be. Survival was a collective act, and compassion was not a luxury, but a necessity. One night, unable to sleep, Aldrich walked to the church and sat in the cold, empty nave. He did not pray in any formal sense. He simply sat with his fear and his exhaustion, and his love for his son, and let the silence of the stone walls hold him. Father Clement found him there just before dawn, and sat beside him without speaking. After a long while, the priest placed a hand on Aldrich's shoulder and said quietly that God tests those he loves most, and that the suffering of this world is but a shadow compared to the glory that awaits the faithful. Aldrich nodded. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it, because if this life, the hunger, the labor, the helplessness, the constant fear of losing everything he loved, if this was all there was, then the weight of it would be too much for any human soul to bear. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Thomas began to recover. The fever broke on a Tuesday morning, and the boy opened his eyes and asked for water, in a voice so thin it was barely audible. Maren wept with a relief so violent it shook her entire body. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the hut, watching, and felt something unlock in his chest that he had been holding tight for weeks. The village would later say that it was the herbs, or the prayers, or simply the stubbornness of a child too young to understand he was supposed to die. Whatever the reason, Thomas lived, and in a world where so many did not, that was enough. That was everything. Winter passed the way winters always passed in Witchford, slowly, painfully, with its fingers wrapped around the throat of every family in the village. 3 people died during those cold months. Old Edgith, whose knowledge of herbs and remedies had been the closest thing Witchford had to medicine, died quietly in her sleep in January. She was mourned by the entire village, and her passing left a gap that would not be filled for years. A young cotter named Edwin died of a fever that spread through the lower end of the village, and a newborn belonging to Wulfric's family did not survive its first week. These deaths were recorded briefly in the parish register, a name, a date, sometimes a cause, and then life continued, because it had to. There was no time for extended mourning. The fields would not wait. The Lord's demands would not wait. Grief was a luxury that peasants carried silently, buried in the same earth they worked every day. When spring finally arrived, Aldrich felt it not as joy but as relief. The kind of relief a drowning man feels when his head breaks the surface of the water. The earth softened, the days lengthened. The cycle of planting and growing and harvesting began again, and with it came a rhythm that was in its way a form of comfort. This was what the modern world often fails to understand about peasant life in the Dark Ages. It was not merely a life of suffering, it was a life of profound routine, of deep connection to the land and the seasons, of relationships forged in shared hardship that were as strong and real as anything the human heart has ever produced. Aldrich and Maren did not have the language to articulate what they felt for each other, for their children, for their village. They did not write letters or compose poems, or leave behind the kind of personal records that would allow future historians to reconstruct their inner lives with any precision. What they left behind was simpler and, in many ways, more eloquent, the evidence of endurance. The fields they ploughed, the walls they mended, the children they raised and raised again, the customs they followed, not because they understood their origins, but because those customs were the threads that held the fabric of their world together. The customs and traditions of Dark Age peasant life were not mere habits. They were survival mechanisms encoded in ritual, the communal feast days when the entire village gathered to share whatever food could be spared, served a purpose far deeper than celebration. They reinforced bonds. They reminded every family that they were part of something larger than themselves. They gave people a reason, however brief, to feel something other than exhaustion and fear. The harvest festivals, the midsummer bonfires, the Christmas gatherings in the church, these were the moments when peasant life revealed its hidden warmth, its stubborn capacity for joy in the midst of conditions that should have crushed the human spirit entirely. Aldrich watched his son Thomas playing with the other children at the spring feast, running between the legs of adults, laughing at something only children find funny, and he felt a sensation he could not name rise in his chest. It was not happiness exactly. It was something older and deeper, a recognition that this moment, this small island of warmth and noise and life, was worth everything it had cost to reach. Every hour in the fields, every hunger pain ignored, every night spent lying awake listening to his child's labored breathing and bargaining with God for one more day. All of it had led here to this boy running through the spring mud, with the sun on his face, alive and whole and laughing. The peasants of the Dark Ages did not know they were living in the Dark Ages. They did not know that future centuries would look back on their lives with a mixture of pity and fascination. They did not know that the systems that bound them, the feudal obligations, the church's authority, the rigid social hierarchy, would eventually crumble and be replaced by new systems that were, in many ways, equally imperfect. They knew only what was in front of them: the earth, the sky, the people they loved, the work that never ended, and the quiet, unshakable faith that their suffering meant something, even if they could not see the full shape of it from where they stood. Aldrich lived to be 38, an above-average lifespan for a man of his station. He died in the fields, as many peasants did, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated toll of decades of labor that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. Maren survived him by 4 years, long enough to see Thomas grow into a young man who would take over his father's strips and continue the same cycle of planting and harvesting and paying and enduring that had defined every generation before him. The village of Witchford itself survived for another 2 centuries before the Black Death and the social upheavals that followed it transformed the English countryside beyond recognition. But in the year 1247, none of that had happened yet. In 1247, Aldrich was simply a man standing in a field, watching his son play, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on his tired back, and knowing, in a way that required no words, no philosophy, no education, that this was his life. All of it, the pain and the love and the labor and the beauty and the loss. This was what it took to live as a peasant, and despite everything, despite the hunger and the injustice and the exhaustion and the grief, it was, in its own quiet and defiant way, a life fully lived. The customs and traditions of the Dark Ages were not relics of a primitive world. They were the architecture of survival, built by ordinary people who faced extraordinary hardship, with nothing but their hands, their faith, and each other. And if we listen carefully enough, past the centuries of noise and progress and forgetting, we can still hear them. In the rhythm of the seasons, in the bonds between neighbors, in the stubborn, beautiful, heartbreaking insistence of the human spirit that life, no matter how hard, is worth living. If you watched until the very end, it is because this story touched something real inside you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so that I can get to know you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think or reflect, or see history through different eyes, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Press the like button to help this video reach more people who deserve to hear these forgotten voices. And if you know someone who would appreciate this story, share it with them, because some stories are too important to keep to ourselves.